Bump Voices with Vision on 89.3 FM, Tuesdays at 9 a.m. for eye-opening dissection of social justice news. Listener discretion is advised because this is not for the politically faint at heart. Tell Lottie Dottie and everybody if you're not for the liberation of the people, fall back. Find past episodes on Player FM, iTunes Podcast, and Google Play Music. On your station for jazz and justice, WPFW, Washington.
Welcome to On the Margin with E. Ethelbert Miller. My guests today are Aldon Nielsen and Sally Schwartz. Aldon Nielsen is an author, a playwright, and actually a poet and literary critic. He's also a professor in the English department at Penn State. Aldon Nielsen is the author of C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction. Sally Schwartz, who's actually here in the studio with me, is the executive director of Globalized DC. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Great. You know, we are going to talk about Cyril Lionel Robert James, C.L.R. James, historian, journalist, socialist, Pan-Africanist. He also wrote under the name of J.R. Johnson. He was born in Trinidad in 1901. He died in London in 1989. C.L.R. James was the author of such classic books as The Black Jacobins, Beyond the Boundary, and Minty Alley. So those are some of the things. But I want to ask you, Aldon, and you, Sally, why is it important to read C.L.R. James's work today?
Well, first of all, I want to say, how heartening it is to be on the air with friends on this sad day when we've lost Elijah Cummings. That's the news I woke up to this morning. And also, it was funny that you slipped and called me a playwright, because I actually did have a play produced back when I was a student of C.L.R. James's. And a quick funny story. A couple of us were having plays on, and I mentioned that to C.L.R., and he said, "Well, I have a play." And that's how I found out about it. But anyway, to my mind, C.L.R. James is of the same stature as a W.B. Du Bois, although not represented as well by American publishers. Sorry to say, their lives were very similar. They were worldwide figures. Who made tremendous contributions in multiple fields. James was an early fiction writer from Trinidad, wrote one of the first Yard novels, as they called it, Minty Alley. Then he was this great revolutionary philosopher represented by books such as World Revolution and Notes on Dialectic. He was one of the most important historians of the 20th century, represented by books like Black Jacobins. And he was an international activist. He was sitting on the stage with Kwame Nkrumah when Ghana celebrated their independence, for example. So just in almost every field you can think of, with the small exception of lyric poetry, C.L.R. James made tremendous contributions that we're still in the process of recognizing.
Mm-hmm. Sally?
Yes, well, I would agree. He was the 20th century. To me, he lived from 1901 to 1989, and he lived and had an impact on so many events. I would also say, living in D.C., he was part of our local history as well and affected a lot of people. I think today we have a lot to learn from C.L.R., and I sort of draw inspiration from him. So I agree. He made such a huge contribution, and we just don't know enough about him, and too many people don't know about him. So
I'm glad we mentioned the names of Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah. Two other names we might want to add would be Marcus Garvey and also George Padmore, people that C.L.R. knew. But we're talking about a person who has that type of stature, and so I think Mike is going to help us with. We'll hear a little excerpt of C.L.R. James speaking.
Christopher Columbus landed first in the New World at the island of San Salvador, and after praising God, inquired urgently for gold. The natives, Red Indians, were peaceable and friendly, and directed him to Haiti, a large island, nearly as large as Ireland, rich, they said, in the yellow metal. He sailed to Haiti. One of his ships being wrecked, The Haitian Indians helped him so willingly that very little was lost, and of the articles which they brought on shore, not one was stolen. The Spaniards, the most advanced Europeans of their day, annexed the island, called it Hispaniola, and took the backward natives under their protection. They introduced Christianity, forced labor in mines, murder, rape, bloodhounds, strange diseases, and artificial famine by the destruction of cultivation to starve the rebellious. These and other requirements of the higher civilization reduced the native population from an estimated 500,000, perhaps 1 million, to 60,000 in 15 years.
And thus it is that Dr. C.L.R. James, a very distinguished scholar, reads the first 2 paragraphs of his prologue, a remarkable book, a classic, The Black Jacobins, which deals with the Toussaint Louverture-led Black Slave Rebellion in San Domingo 2 years after the French Revolution. In these 2 paragraphs, Dr. James, your style of writing, of course, is a very salubrious one indeed, but the bite, the irony, and the truth, you might say, of white man and all these years of Western civilization, so-called. In these 2 paragraphs, you've almost essentialized it.
Yes, I think so, and I wrote it quite naturally. I didn't have to search, but I am a West Indian, and we in the West Indies are very much aware of the contrast between what the white man says and what he does, because we are Western civilized in our orientation, so we are aware of all the things he's saying, much more than people who speak a different language or live a different type of civilization.
This very point you make, which you point out, Professor James is now visiting professor at the Northwestern University. The fact that you're West Indian, this has always been a fascinating historical point, isn't it? We think among the leaders and the whole black liberation movement through the years have been West Indians.
Yes, we have had a whole lot of them. We have had Marcus Garvey. We have had Aimé Césaire, the poet, with that magnificent poem on Africa in which he stated the question of negritude. We have had René Marin, who won the Prix Goncourt with a book, Batuala, on Africa. We have had George Padmore, Marcus Garvey, as I said, and we have had, there's no doubt about it, that Malcolm X's mother was a West Indian, and that had something to do with it, and Stokely Carmichael was born and grew up there as a boy. I also took some part. I believe it is something that is worthwhile, and I know and feel myself as a West Indian as Padmore was.
It's as though two cultures are fused, in a sense.
Yes, we are not admitted completely into the Western culture, but we have all the possibilities of developing it. So on being kept back at home, we went abroad and made the best use of both the opportunities of education and the impulse towards freedom which we felt in the islands. That is the reason why the West Indians have done so well. And I would like to add this, that Fidel Castro and the Cubans are not all black people. Fidel isn't black at all. But the attitude of the revolution and what they are doing is essentially a West Indian revolution, similar to what Toussaint Louverture did.
Yes, so we come, in fact, you have an appendix to your book, an epilogue. You wrote the book in 1938, how remarkably prescient and prophetic Professor James' book is, because he dealt with the nature of Africa and the possible independence movement.
You were listening to the voice of C.L.R. James. My guest today on The Margin is Aldon Nielsen and Sally Schwartz, and we're going to be talking about C.L.R. James during this hour. As you know, this is also the fall drive here at WPFW, so while you're listening to us discuss C.L.R. James, you might realize, well, you can't hear this on any other station, and you might want to call 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739, and make us a pledge and support what we are trying to do here. The tape that you were hearing that we just played of C.L.R. James was around 1970 when he was at Northwestern University before coming to Washington and being at Federal City College. Aldon Nielsen, I want to turn to you in terms of one, responding to what our listeners were just listening to, and then take us into you meeting C.L.R. James at Federal City College.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the audience should know that the person doing that interview is Studs Terkel, one of the great interviewers of all time, almost as good as Ethelbert, in Chicago. I get very nostalgic whenever I listen to that recording because that's exactly what he sounded like in the classroom. I confess to my embarrassment that as I began undergraduate studies at Federal City College, now UDC, I'd never heard of C.L.R. James. But I was taking a Caribbean literature course with Gregory Rigsby, who's now retired, also from Trinidad. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we read Black Jacobins. Anyone studying Caribbean literature reads Black Jacobins, even though it's not technically a literary text. It's very literary. And one day, as I mentioned in my book, we were having a discussion about this paragraph, and I just commented about how well written it was. And Professor Rigsby said, "You should tell him that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he's right downstairs." So I went downstairs to the history department, enrolled in his classes, and stayed. I was an English major, but I took all of his history courses. The two main ones I took, one was on African revolutionary movements, the other one was on Latin American intellectual history. And it was an intriguing situation because there were really sort of courses in C.L.R. James. As a professor, I always wished I could just offer a course in what I want to talk about today. There were, he was disciplined. They were always relevant to the topic of the course, but he would come in and he would speak just the way you heard him right then. But he always reserved a part at the end of the class for what he called free-for-all, when anybody could ask him anything about any subject. Mm-hmm. And there were usually visitors in the class, and I hope somebody survived. Someone was always taping on those old cassette recorders we had, and I'm sure most of those tapes got turned into mixtapes with music or something. But
what was happening at Federal City College? Who were some of the people that you recall?
What wasn't happening? When I tell my Harvard and Yale colleagues about my educational background, they think I'm lying, because my creative writing teacher, as you know, was Gil Scott Heron. Mm-hmm. Okay. So he was there. The novelist the memoirist Leslie Lacey was there. I mentioned Greg Rigsby, who was an incredible teacher. Here's a funny one. William Couch was chair of the department.
Or playwright, yeah.
He was better known for having edited them. Yeah. But even while I was a student there, I'm reading these poems by Gwendolyn Brooks about World War II, and I see a dedication to someone with the same name, and I realized it was the same person. And then when her first autobiographical book came out, Report from Part 1, I discovered he was her high school crush when she was a kid. Fast forward to my days as an adjunct at Howard, who am I sharing an office with, who's also working as an adjunct at that time for some reason, is the same William Couch. Mm-hmm. But it was a place of amazing possibility. It had been formed in the late 1960s, mid 1960s. Johnson was still president. Mm-hmm. As an unusual thing, an urban land grant school with no land. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask Sally if she wants to respond to anything that we heard James talking about.
Back to the clip. Just listening to the video just brings C.L.R. back. He had a very distinctive style. He was just very alive, mm-hmm. and every point he made. Even some that might have been trivial, he just had a punctuation behind it. And,
Well, let me link this to your research, because around 1978, you were a graduate student at Howard.
Yes.
And your area was Caribbean Studies. Okay?
Yes.
So when we go back to the clip, and you hear C.L.R. talking about the Caribbean, how does that flesh with your research in terms of your knowledge of the area? How important is C.L.R. James in terms of understanding the Caribbean?
Right. Well, I had come to, listening to this parallel story, it was similar in my case. I had gone to Cornell as an undergraduate and taught history in public school here, and then went to Howard to pursue my interest in the Caribbean. I had gone to Cornell and was very interested in African studies because I had begun that in high school. And I had a professor by the name of Loxley Edmondson, who was on the board of Trans-Africa. Mm-hmm. Do you know Loxley? Mm-hmm. And he taught a course among others, in Pan-Africanism. And that's when I was first introduced to C.L.R. And through Loxley Edmondson, I got very interested in the Caribbean. Precisely on this point that there was something very distinctive about the West Indians who are coming out of that, had the European and the African and other cultures and histories to draw on, and we're making this just outside contribution to world history. So I kind of pursued that, and then went to Howard, did a paper for Allison Blakely in a course called Comparative Socialism.
Okay.
And I decided to do a paper on C.L.R. James. And it was about 1 week before this big paper was due. And someone said, and it was done, and someone said to me, "Oh, did you interview C.L.R.?" And I said, "What are you talking about? I don't know where he is." And they said, "He's at UDC." So at this point, it was the 70s, so it was UDC at that point. They said, "He's very accessible. You can talk to him." So I somehow called him up. He said, "Come down to the political science department." And we sat in the lobby area, and I had read anything that I could get my hands on. So he was sort of impressed with me because I was able to ask him some very specific questions. And that led to the next part of the story.
Right, and that's when I believe I met you, because I always associated you with C.L.R. James. So talk about that relationship, because it seems as if, you got to know him very well.
Well, after that, it happened very quickly, because after that initial interview, maybe I spent a half an hour with him. He said to me, "Here's my number. Call me at home, if you have any further questions." And of course, I took the opportunity to call him at home. And he said, "Well, I think we should meet me on Sunday morning at a place called Trader Vic's." Now, old D.C. people will remember Trader Vic's was a Polynesian restaurant at 16th and K. Meet me for the Sunday brunch, which was a champagne brunch. I mean, I was a poor graduate student.
You went for the champagne.
And I went for C.L.R.
Just joking, Sally.
But we sat and had a long lunch, and at the end of the brunch, and after a couple hours of talking, which was, a lot of it was about women, which was really, he was very interested in women at that point in his life. Well, in probably more ways than one, but he was re-examining his relationship with women, among other things. But at the end of the meal, he said to me, now this is the second time I had met him, he said, I was working on a master's thesis on Trinidad, and he said, "Have you ever been to Trinidad?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Why not?" I said, "I don't have the money for the plane. I don't have the money to go down there." And he said, "How much would it cost?" And I said, maybe like $500. And with that, he reached into his pocket and put on the table 5 $100 bills and pushed them towards me. And I, of course, dismissed it and said, "Absolutely not." And he said, "Sally, you really surprised me. I've been sitting, listening to you. You seem like a 21st century woman. These bourgeois conventions don't become you." And he said, "I'm a person with the money. You're a graduate student. You need the money to do your work. So you should take it." And I took the money, went down to the Caribbean, and I worked with him that summer as his I'm going
to interrupt you right there because, as I said earlier, this is our fundraising drive here at WPFW, and we need your money. And so if there's anybody out there that has $500 and then can just push it across the air as opposed to the table, we will be deeply grateful. The number here at the station is 202-588-9739. It's 202-588-9739. You're just listening to Sally Schwartz, who is the Executive Director of Globalized DC. She's here in the studio with me, and on the phone is Aldon Nielsen, who is the author of C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction. And Aldon, I want you to talk a little bit about this book that you did, and I want you to talk about Minty Alley that James wrote in the 1920s and was actually published in 1936.
Well, first of all, I have to say I'm surprised to hear that C.L.R. James had $500. He must have just gotten a royalty check or something, because he was a professor at UDC, which did not pay all that well.
And I'm glad you said that, because we're trying to raise $600 this hour. Okay?
There you go. Yeah. Well, and I want to also add, I was there when PFW first came to Washington, D.C., when they were next to a laundromat and above a little church and so forth, and people really need to support this station. You saw what happened up in New York.
WBI, correct. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, but the book, I had always, C.L.R. James had meant so much to me, so much to my life. He's probably the main reason it occurred to me to become a professor. I had not been thinking of it before he put that idea in my head. But I'd always had it in the back of my mind to do a book someday. I thought I would do it maybe when I retired. But then Sita Srinivasan, who was the director of Mississippi University Press in those days, contacted me because she saw I was giving a James talk at a conference. And I had a long discussion with Bobby Hill about whether I should do this or not, and found him encouraging, which is not always the case. And so I undertook the project, and I'm really glad. It's quite a different book from most of the others about James.
And this book came out in 1997.
97. We need more like that now, and later on I'll talk about how there's more on the way. But I just was contacted. I don't know if you heard from him. There's a guy in England who's writing a new biography, and I'm really hoping this will be more like the kind of massive. The first two biographies were done while he was still alive. And that's were complete. The third one was done by a guy in England who apparently hated C.L.R. James. So I'm really hoping we get a really good biography this time. But Minty Alley, yes, James was part of a group of young writers in Trinidad who were reaching out to the other parts of the Caribbean. They were really starting to think of themselves as West Indian writers at a time when that wasn't so much acknowledged. Thanks to the BBC in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that really became more prominent. But back in the 1930s, they were, just not on the literary map of England to speak of. And they got together and they put out a literary journal, and they would meet and read their works to one another. And he published several truly important, landmark West Indian stories, like The Star That Would Not Shine. It's one of my favorites. But then he undertook the writing of this novel, and as I said, it's the first, what came to be known as the Yard novels. The Yards were these, in British colonial terms, they call them barracks yards. They were essentially poor people's neighborhoods, but they were built almost like an army barracks. In fact, I think the original ones had been abandoned army barracks. And, James wrote what is probably the first, it's not the first Trinidadian novel, but probably the first Trinidadian novel that takes a realistic approach to the lives of everyday working people. And as you mentioned, he still had that manuscript in his suitcase when he went to England, where in rapid succession he publishes his novel Minty Alley, Black Jacobins, A World Revolution, all within a period of a couple of years. And Minty Alley was the only one that he had already written. And again, if you're a student of Caribbean literature in general, British Commonwealth literature in general, this novel was a landmark. If you've read the novel, you're kind of sorry that he became such a crucial revolutionary philosopher, because we wanted more novels from C.L.R. James too. He was working. I should mention in relation to something Sally said. He was working on an autobiography, which I knew he would never finish, because every time he talked about it, he would say, "Well, I'm going to have a chapter on Solzhenitsyn. I'm going to have a chapter on Shakespeare." One of the chapters that was finished and is in the archive is a chapter where he was rethinking his lifelong relationships with women. And it's a really intriguing document. And Sally made me think of that when she was talking about her first conversations with him.
Well, when you mentioned that relationship with women, I found that in the correspondence, with Constance Webb, you see a lot of his views about women. That's in some of the letters. But let me let's get back to the Minty Alley, and then I want Sally to jump in here. It seems that in that novel, we get a sense of issues of class among black people, and just talk about how that seems to be key to James's analysis in terms of his Marxist analysis.
Yeah, well, and the novel centers on the lives of the women in that barrack yard, and. For people who don't know the novel, it's narrated by a character. A lot of people read this as an autobiographical novel. It is not. That main character, Haynes, shares a lot of experiences with C.L.R., but he's not C.L.R. James, and people tend to forget that. But the main character, he's sort of someone who has no direction in life. He's been working at a bookstore. His mother passes away, and he inherits this little bit of property. And because of financial reverses, partly because he's got no head for business whatsoever, he winds up moving to this barracks yard and meeting all these women that live there. And each one sort of represents a different situation. The woman who's the landlord at Minty Alley, landlady, I guess, while he's living there, is a representative of someone who's come up poor, but is really trying to somehow find a financial footing in the world. She's got the Living Color TV show used to have this joke about the hardest working West Indian family in America. So everyone's got these hustles going on. So in addition to having renters, she's got this whole baking business going on, and she employs a representative of the East Indian West Indians, and then there's this other woman who's a light-skinned nurse who's trying to work her way up in the professional world. So what you see in this barracks yard in Minty Alley is in a small space representatives of each of these struggling classes in Trinidad who are trying somehow, in the wake of slavery and colonialism, to get a foothold in the world and to try to have better lives. Mm-hmm. And all of this is seen through the eyes of Haynes, who doesn't quite understand things. He's almost always the last one to figure out what's going on.
Well, I'm gonna ask Sally to comment on Minty Alley. I just also want to thank Joanne and Bethesda, who's just made a contribution to us for this hour. So Joanne and Bethesda, thank you very much. And so hopefully other people will make a contribution this hour. We need $550 to reach our goal. Sally, any comments about Minty Alley?
I'm going to pass on Minty
Alley.
Okay,
you're going to pass on
Minty Alley was the first book that I read of his.
Okay.
But I'm going to reread it now, listening to you talk about it.
Minty Alley was not available in the United States when he was teaching Federal City College. There was a bookstore over by Howard that imported copies from England, I think it was, that we got hold of.
Well, let's talk about that. Yes, let's talk about that.
Well, I was going to say the same woman who persuaded me to do this book is the one who made the deal to make that book available here in the United States. So you can get that paperback from the Mississippi University Press now to this day.
Okay. Well, when I came in contact with C.L.R. James, the book, The History of the Pan-African Revolt, had just been reprinted, and that was reprinted by the Drum and Spear bookstore, Drum and Spear Press. A key person responsible for that was the civil rights activist Charlie Cobb. I believe PM Press has reprinted the book with a new introduction by Robin Kelly. Right. And in that introduction, he sort of captures what we will be talking about in a program at UDC next week, and that is the impact of C.L.R. James on young activists in Washington, but young activists who are very much involved not only in the civil rights movement, but also beginning to have an interest in terms of black studies. So, Sally, you said you'll pass on Minty Alley. Do you want to catch the history of the Pan-African Revolt, or should I pass that on to...
No, I'm going to defer to the professor on the literary analysis.
Okay, and then we'll go to a break. So, Aldon, you want to comment on the history of the Pan-African Revolt?
Well, of course, back in the 30s when he first wrote it, it was a history of Negro revolt.
Negro, right.
Then Drum and Spear republished it as the History of Pan-African Revolt. I think that's when he added a chapter to bring up to date. The audience should know this is a very short book, so you can get like a quick run-through of the history of black revolutionary politics and movements.
I like when you say there's a short thing. That's when people are saying, okay, I have the history of Pan-African Revolt, and I have the Quotable Karanga, and I have all these other,
Well, as opposed to, I would also push people to read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism someday, but that's a much longer book.
Right.
Yeah, but Drum and Spear, when I was a high school student, I guess just graduating from high school, my girlfriend was in Upward Bound at Howard, and I remember going to pick her up for a date and sitting in this lounge, and the whole lounge was full of books that had been donated by Drum and Spear. And, of course, this was before people associated with Drum and Spear had been assassinated while the Rat Brown trial was going on over in Maryland. But my first introduction to Drum and Spear, and this was before they published that book even, I think, was seeing these books that they had donated for students to be able to read. I think I was reading a collection of Castro's speeches or something that they had. But yeah, History of Negro Revolt, then titled History of Pan-African Revolt. I think this is its third or fourth reprinting now. And again, for a book that was written back in the 1930s and was meant to be more of an outline than anything else, that book really does still hold up.
Well, we're still holding up here, and we're holding up here because some people like Maritza, who I don't know Maritza, she's in Rockville, Maryland. I know that's a woman who's part of the Mariposa. She's also, she loves books. I mean, she walks around with boxes of books whenever she is having a retreat. And I want to thank you, Maritza, for your support, which is not only for WPFW, but just the wonderful things you've been doing for the literary community in the area. We're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about C.L.R. James. If you're listening in this morning, you're listening to Aldon Nielsen, who's calling in from Pennsylvania. He is a professor at Penn State. He's the author of C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction. And in the studio here with me is my friend Sally Schwartz, who is the executive director of Globalized DC. So my name's Ethelbert Miller. The show's On the Margin. The station's WPFW 89.3 FM.
Hi, I'm Joseph Green, and this is your WPFW Social Justice Calendar for the Washington metro area. Saturday, October 19th, the public event of the National Network on Cuba meeting taking place in Washington, D.C. the weekend of October 18th will feature speakers Dr. Jordy James, Cuban economist, and Jose Ramon Cabanas, Cuban ambassador, with musical and poetry performances. 7 p.m. at the African American Civil War Museum, 1925 Vermont Avenue, Northwest D.C. For more information, call 202-503-9465 or send an email to DC Metro Coalition for Cuba @gmail.com. Also, Saturday, October 19th, Research 101 LGBTQ plus resources will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Washington Blade and LGBTQ plus History Month. Learn about the history resources available from special collections, 12 noon until 1 p.m. at Washingtoniana, 4340 Connecticut Avenue Northwest. For more information, call 202-727-1213 or go online to the dclibrary.org/wash. Sunday, October 20th, Gaza Palestinian scholar and activist Yusuf al-Jamal and author and activist Miko Peled will discuss critical aspects of Palestinian life today, 1 to 3 p.m. at Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ, 5301 North Capitol Street, Northeast, Washington, D.C. For more information, call 202-723-5300 or visit the Facebook page of Plymouth Board of Social Action. Monday, October 21st. Come for the Washington, D.C. launch of Walden Bellow's new book, Paper Dragons, China and the Next Crash, that addresses the question, will China be the epicenter of the world's next financial collapse? 12:30 to 2 p.m. at the Institute for Policy Studies, 1301 Connecticut Avenue Northwest on the 6th floor. For more information, visit the webpage ips-dc.org/events or call 202-787-5229. Tuesday, October 22nd, Nicaraguan prisoner of conscience Carlos Mejia will talk about mainstream media coverage of the violence in Nicaragua in 2018 and the current efforts for peace and reconciliation in his homeland. 6:30 to 9 p.m. at the Owen Brown Interfaith Center, 7246 Cradle Rock Way, Columbia, Maryland. For more information, call Leslie at 410-381-4899 or email cuba_is_hope@comcast.net. For an online listing of these events, or if you like your social justice event included in the social justice calendar, visit the webpage ips-dc.org/social justice calendar, where you will find submission guidelines. The social justice calendar is a public service brought to you by the Institute for Policy Studies in partnership with WPFW, your station for jazz and justice.
Okay, we're back on the margin, and I want to thank two wonderful people, Ture and Carolyn Joyner, for making a pledge to WPFW. Ture and Carolyn, thank you. You've been, I guess, consistent, supporters of On the Margin, and we couldn't stay on the air without you. And so we only need to raise $260.70. The 70 cents is probably from Mike, but that's another issue.
Buy lunch for Mike.
Buy lunch for Mike. So I want to thank our listeners, because without their support, it wouldn't be possible. Next week, for those of you who are out there listening, we are going to have a program on UDC's campus on C.L.R. James, the legacy of C.L.R. James and the influence on D.C. activists. And that's going to be October 22nd at 7 p.m. in Building 44, Room 44A03. And so that's going to be on the campus of UDC, 7 o'clock, October 22nd, Building 44, Room 44A03. And there you will be able to meet Aldon Nielsen and Sally Schwartz in the flesh. Okay, you can't beat that. Okay,
I'm getting more fleshy every year.
Right. And so I want to thank you for Aldon for coming down from Pennsylvania. For this program. I want Sally. You had the chapter about women in C.L.R.
Oh, I do have that chapter that you were referring to on women. This elusive autobiography is very interesting to me because that's how he got me. and I think there were a series of probably people of the female persuasion who were what he would call his amanuensis, which I had to look up. He asked for help in doing his autobiography. As Ethelbert and I were discussing, C.L.R. had a significant tremor in his hands, apparently for a long time.
Right.
But and as long as
back to the early '60s. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah.
No, actually, Aldon. I was reading the letter to Constance Webb, and he makes reference to his hands shaking back in the 1940s. And he started dictating some of his letters. Yeah. So it goes back that early.
So, it was difficult for him to write. And, of course, for any listeners that are younger than myself or all of us here, we have to remind you there was no Internet in those days, and people didn't use computers until later. So he had to handwrite his writing was handwritten, and it was difficult. So people like myself came in to help him with writing. Now, I didn't really consider that seemed below not my pay grade, but it was C.L.R. So it was just absolutely fascinating. And again, the women's chapter was something that he was really kind of focused on, or he had just sort of finished it, and he was really thinking a lot about that he really hadn't understood women and was trying to sort of grapple with that and his own personal history and just think more generally.
So, Aldon, go from what Sally just said about women. Could you comment on C.L.R.'s relationship with Constance Webb?
Oh, well, if people read the book you're referring to, I think it's out of print again, but there are lots of used copies around this correspondence that C.L.R. sent to Constance.
One is not without love.
You're right. She was a young model and actress when he first meets her in L.A. She had gone to attend one of his talks at one of the socialist organizations he gave in Los Angeles. That's how they met. And he's considerably older than her. Mm-hmm. I tell people this is the most astonishing seduction you've ever read in your life because, he's trying to persuade her to consider having an ongoing relationship with this, much older man. But they're having all these talks about Melville and Whitman.
That's how it starts, Aldon.
Marxist politics. Yeah, that's how it's. Now, it has to be said, even into his late 70s, C.L.R. James was a flirtatious fellow. But it also needs, this is why the subject of James and women is so complex. Because on the one hand, during his American years, when he's mostly working underground, under assumed names and so forth, his political group was a rare group that really had women in leadership positions, particularly Grace Lee Boggs and Raya Dunevskaya. And even in the socialist activist organizations of those days, that was unusual. That said, he still was a kind of a Victorian in some ways, and this is why he was still sort of wrestling. On the one hand, he was a tremendous promoter of young women writers like, in those days, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison. But he still sort of, had those Victorian ideas about male-female relationships, as to be said. But the dictating had been going on even before he had the tremor, throughout his political career. And this might just be because his mind worked faster than his hand could write. He not only gave speeches with no notes, but he would dictate to people sitting at typewriters or taking notes in his political organization. So a lot of that early work was already being dictated. But if you read enough of his work, you can see in the later years it's quite clear that these were the later ones were all spoken pieces and weren't quite as writerly as the earlier work.
Well, let me ask you this, Aldon, also Sally. I'm just curious about this. Constance Webb is also associated with Richard Wright, and I was wondering if that does she become the link between Richard Wright and C.L.R. James?
Well, they were fast friends with the family. As I mentioned in my book, there was Richard Wright, just before he went to Paris, had this idea, well, two ideas really. One was a book that would be kind of a response to what the Negro wants. It would be a more radical response to that kind of book. And the other was an idea for a magazine called American Pages. And he really had kind of a black brain trust lined up for this. Melvin Tolson was going to write for it. Ralph Ellison was going to write for it. C.L.R. James was going to write for it. And then things take a turn. Wright goes to Paris, and nothing ever comes of that. But I think James had actually known Richard Wright first, and this is probably how Constance got to know him. But yes, later in life she was able to publish her biography of Richard Wright. And if you've read Wright biographies, each one of them is wildly different from the others. As you know, our great poet friend in Mississippi, who's Margaret Walker, right? Who had a contract for quite a long time
with Howard University Press.
But that book finally came out many years later, and I think well after Constance's. But Margaret had also been in Chicago. All these people knew each other, and this is part of the story that I hope a new biography will tell.
Okay.
James also knew Baldwin before Baldwin was really much of a writer.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank Gina Lewis, who's just made a pledge from Fort Washington, Maryland. Thank you, Gina Lewis, which means now all we need to have is $225.70. 70 cents, Mike, because that's your 70 cents? Yes. $225 to go, and we can meet our goal. I want to really thank everyone listening in, because I think, this discussion of C.L.R. James is very rich, and I'm thankful for Sally Schwartz and Aldon Nielsen to be here. I want to talk about Black Jacobins, because many times when people talk about C.L.R. James, that's the book that they always talk about. And I'll begin with you, Sally, because, it's dealing with the Caribbean, and that's just an important book.
Right. What struck me and what has stayed with me, again, this notion that the Caribbean person, the person in the Caribbean, has his own history, but they are the epicenter of capitalism. They have experienced it. They know it. They're right there. So they have knowledge and experience with European civilization, with African civilization, and with this new kind of society, and that they are able, that the common man and woman, and I heard Selma James recently say C.L.R. didn't believe in the common man. Every man or woman was extraordinary, so there were no common men, but that it was the common people, and Toussaint was one of those who took that knowledge and had the capacity to create this great revolution that changed the world. And this sort of weaponizing European culture and the understanding of, the rights of man, and was able to turn that, and that transform the society from the bottom. So I think, to me, that was I was very impressed with that. Mm-hmm. That sort of stayed with me.
Aldon, you want to add anything?
Well, I'll just say a little bit about the circumstances of the book. As he mentions in the preface, like his favorite novel, Vanity Fair, there's cannon fire in the background as he's doing this research and writing. And what he's talking about is the swiftly approaching World War II. But he really wrote that book with Africa in mind, and that also is very clear in that early 30s edition. The book is republished in, 63, 64, somewhere around there. And everyone knows that he added this appendix, which Sally referred to earlier, and it's a crucial piece of writing to look at, partly because of an argument he makes about Africans in the West and the advent of modernity, but also because suddenly he's talking about not only Aimé Césaire, but Wilson Harris. And you have to think, some people looking at this book of revolutionary history were going, Wilson who? What's this Wilson Harris guy, right? But also, less evident, he made some other changes, particularly towards the end of the book. If I remember right, David Scott, in his book Conscripts of Modernity, looked a little bit about those changes. So even for James himself, it was a living book. And, of course, that's the one book of his that's been in print, throughout most of my lifetime. It's often people's first door into knowing about C.L.R. James and his work. So that even though we've had more up-to-date histories of the revolution of Haiti since then, this is still the classic that people turn to as their starting point and then come back to. They help them understand the later books that they've read. You said something very interesting, and I'll draw upon you as Aldon Nielsen, the poet, because you talk about how C.L.R. is constantly changing this, updating it. And I know in one of the letters to we'll get back to Constance Webb, there was a discussion of Walt Whitman, who he admired. And we know that Whitman was always revising. And I was wondering whether this might have been something that might have been an influence on C.L.R. Well, if you read across the history of James Whitman, you find he didn't always admire Walt Whitman. At one point he called the writings of Walt Whitman a damp squib. I had to look. Yeah, he also didn't like Paul Robeson's acting in Othello, but that's another issue. Well, there were always political issues. Like he wasn't really wild about Neruda, and I think it was probably because of Neruda's attachment to the Communist Party. Likewise, he could be very hostile towards Sartre, and I think for the very same reasons. Because he also seemed to be a champion of writers who were very similar to them. Like he loved Beckett, for example. So sometimes I do think the politics colored his view. Okay, so now you know what we'll do right now. Let's put the literature aside and let's just talk about C.L.R. James and his fascination with popular culture. Because when people went to see him, the TV was always going on. Last time I saw C.L.R. James, the only thing and this was in London, the only person he was talking about was Michael Jackson. That's all he was talking about. That's my last conversation with C.L.R. James about Michael Jackson. There were two absolute constants in his apartment, in the Chesterfield Apartments in Northwest D.C. One was the complete works of Lennon, the multi-volume set that was precariously perched on a shelf over a door. I kept thinking one day we would read that he had died because Lennon had fallen on him or something. And the other was, as you pointed out, the TV set was always on, which, come to think of it, may have predicted my attraction to my wife, who was a media scholar and has the TV always on. But that's another footnote, Aldon. He could actually move back and forth between the most complex philosophical discussion and whatever happened to be on the TV screen. And he was actually looking at it analytically. Now, of course, first of all, he wanted to see cricket, which he didn't get enough of in D.C. But he would actually be talking about the way the shots were set up and the way the actors were moving and things like that. But the popular culture part had always been there. People who know his writings know that not only did he always write about cricket, and he'd been a cricket player himself, but he was one of the first people to do serious critical work on calypso. Mm-hmm. He was interested in the stick fighting rituals of Trinidad and so forth. And, when he comes to the United States, he keeps that. He was still very much interested in the popular culture in the United States, hence the fascination with Michael Jackson. Although I have to rush to say that was the Michael Jackson of the heroic Michael Jackson period before, before his downfall. On that note, I want to thank Alex in Greenbelt, Maryland for making a contribution. And so we only have to, $175 more to go to reach our goal of 600 this hour. The number here at WPFW is 202-588-9739. That's 202-588-9739. I want to make this leap, Aldon and Sally. We're talking about C.L.R. James here in D.C. But there's a photograph that you took of, Sally, of C.L.R. James in London. Yeah. Talk about C.L.R. James in London. Well, I went to visit him, I think, twice when he was in Brixton and living in a little apartment above Race Today, where his was it his cousin or? In fact, you know what? Let me read this, and then this is from Linton Kwesi Johnson in London, and Linton wrote me this note couple weeks ago, and he writes, "As a member of the Race Today collective, I saw Nello, C.L.R. James, regularly. In his last years, he lived above our office in Brixton, and we all had a hand in taking care of him. We organized public speaking events for him and was very proud to have him in our midst as he gave us some added kudos. As an organization, the Race Today Collective was very much in the Jamesian mode, and our politics was grounded in his ideas on race and class. We fully embrace this notion that every cook can govern. I enjoy sitting by his bedside, talking with him, and consider it a privilege to have known him." And that's from Linton Kwesi Johnson. Yeah, so it was similar to, my time with him at the Chastleton, where he had a lot of visitors, and,
I would go into his apartment, and he would be in his single bed, his twin bed. He would be in his bed with, at the time, he was always writing about cricket, which I could never quite understand. He tried to explain it to me, but it just seemed like such a long, it went on for days, right? But he was really so brilliant, I felt. I mean, especially now that I'm closer to the age that he was when I knew him, which was 77. He would have the TV on. Often it was soap operas, and my what he said to me is he was always. I know you know this, Aldon. He was always asking a lot of questions when he met somebody new. He would ask, who your mother was, who your father, who your grandparent, where they came from, what they did, your whole history. And he was so curious. And I think he brought that same kind of curiosity to really understand people and their relationships with each other. He used to talk about types. Like, someone was a type.
And he was very specific. I remember James Early and I, who went to see him, and James Early says, "Oh, you did such and such, like 19 whatever." He says, "No, it was 19." He was very specific. or he would say, "Okay, I'm going to give this talk, and I'm going to be finished at 9:43 or something like that."
That's right. Well, in his bed. So I would go there to take dictation, and he would
and in his pajamas usually.
In his yes, that's probably true. That's true. That's exactly right. He would have all these cricket books and probably other books as well on his bed, under the covers, just all over. So as I would be writing, he would say, in 1942, and he couldn't remember a particular number. So he would say, get this book on page such and such.
Right.
But he had an incredible mind. So, but all the time the soap opera was on, 2 feet from where we were working. So,
and in terms of popular culture, I'll make this note, since the Nats are going to the World Series. I think that C.L.R. I think he went to his first baseball game around 1938, and saw the difference between the baseball game and cricket, because people were much more the fans were much more interacting and yelling and stuff like that. And Mel, Aldon, any comment on that? Because when we go back to Minty Alley, and it seems as if here's an example of C.L.R. James being very much aware of issues of class.
Yeah. Well, also, I would really encourage people to read the book American Civilization, which was written in the late 40s but not published till after he dies. There's a whole section there about a soap opera that moved from the radio to become the film. I forget the title of the film. Barbara Stanwyck is in it. And he's very, very cogent in discussing the way this works and the dialectic between the desires of film production and soap opera production and the desires of the audience and so forth and so on. But he also talks about that baseball game there. And this shows something that I find very interesting, because it's true. When he describes that baseball game, he's talking about everybody shouting and everything, and he seems a little bit surprised by this. But if you go back and read in Beyond a Boundary, he describes some of the cricket matches in Trinidad exactly the same way. So he had seen this, but in a different context, in a different sport. And I guess somehow he hadn't expected this from the Americans for whatever reason. And
we're dancing here. We're dancing here now. So we're coming to the end of our show, Aldon Nielsen and Sally Schwartz. We did extremely well. If people want to call in before we go off the air, we only need $175 to meet our goal of $600 this hour. And we were talking about C.L.R. James, and as I had mentioned in the introduction, Aldon Nielsen is the author of C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction. Our listeners may also want to pick up the C.L.R. James Reader, edited by Anna Grimshaw, or also the C.L.R. James, His Life and Work, edited by Paul Buell. Are there any other books you want to mention?
Well, I want to mention in particular Robert Hill, I mentioned earlier, who's the literary executive for James. He has worked with Duke University Press to create the C.L.R. James Archive series. The first book in the series was that 1930s version of his play in which Paul Robeson appeared. The two most recent one, there's a book called the Black Jacobin's Reader, which is really a wonderful book to go along with Black Jacobins. And there's one I haven't had a chance to read yet that just came out called the Making of Black Jacobins.
It must be very new if you haven't gotten to read it yet.
Well, it's in my mailbox in California.
Okay.
But really keep an eye on that series because it's going to publish both documents of James that James himself left behind and critical studies of James. So I think that's going to go a long way because all this stuff, the Constance Webb letters, American Civilization, the Reader, all these things have gone out of print.
Okay, and that's why I want you. Okay, that's why I want everyone who's listening to come out. And IPPH at UDC is going to be sponsoring a discussion of C.L.R. James. It's called The Legacy of C.L.R. James and His Influence on D.C. Activists. That's going to be October 22nd, 7 p.m., Building 44, Room 44A03. So I'll say again, that's October 22nd, 7 p.m., Building 44, Room 44A03. And I want to thank Sharon Pratt, who heads up the IPPH Institute there at UDC, for being
former mayor,
to hosting this event for us. And once again, I want to thank you, Sally Schwartz, who is the executive director of Global DC, and all the